Welcome to the Oneal Perspective, Politics, Power, and Policy, where we break down the latest in politics, dive deep into forces shaping our society, and uncover the policies that will make it all happen. Your host, Curtis Oneal, is here to educate, enlighten, and entertain as we explore the world of politics with clarity and insight. Whether you're a political junkie or just trying to be informed, you're in the right place. Let's dive in.
And welcome to the Oneal Perspective, Politics, Power, and Policy. I am your host, Curtis Oneal, and today we're going to dive into one of the most heated and divisive issues in America. You know, you heard it. If you're watching TV, you see it in terms of what's going on. If you're listening to the radio, you know what's going on out there. And chances are you know what the issue is, and that's the issue around immigration. Now, of course, this topic is too big just for one episode, and so what we're going to go ahead and do today is I've broken it up into an 8-part series to unpack every angle that's been happening and that's been talking about, and those particular issues that immigration impacts. So those things is in terms of what's really going on at the border, who benefits from our immigration policies, and how it all impacts us in our communities, especially those Black and brown communities. So in episode 1, we're going to basically start with the political divide and talk about how Democrats and Republicans approach immigration. You know, of course, they look at it from different viewpoints, different sides. You hear the Republicans say this, and then you hear Democrats on one particular side. And so basically, and what those policies really mean for the rest of us. Who's pushing for what, but more importantly, I think it's of the importance to understand why they're pushing for that. So anyway, without further ado, I want you all to sort of buckle up because this particular conversation is going to get real. It's going to hit home. And so let's go ahead and get into it. So as you know, there's been a lot of conversation around border policies and how that demographic shift in the United States, it has become such a hot issue politically. As you know, it's a battleground issue that's shaping the future of this particular of our country, and then how it also impacts how other countries feel about the immigration issues. Some argue, of course, that Democrats are pushing for mass immigration to reshape America's racial and political landscape, while Republicans claim their resistance is really about it's about preserving American traditions rather than outright xenophobia. But of course, you know, we all understand, so we're not going to get this particular issue twisted in terms of immigration and how it doesn't just affect the political elite, right? We know that it has real world consequences, especially for Black and brown communities. And so a whole lot is there for us to unpack. In terms of when I think about it, I think about number one, how the influx of immigration and migrants, how they may impact jobs, wages, and economic opportunities for historically marginalized groups of people. And so those are some of the things, again, that we're going to go ahead and get into over this 8-part series, and we're going to break it down. So one of the things I want you to do, if you haven't done so already, I want you to go ahead and pause this. Go ahead and grab a cup of coffee. I think it's also important to grab a notepad. There may be some things that you haven't heard. And as you guys already know, my whole focus with these particular podcasts is through what I like to call the trifecta of ease. And that is to entertain, educate, and hopefully enlighten. So if you haven't grabbed a cup of coffee, notepad, please go ahead and pause this and get it, go get it. And let's get into this. So in terms of picking up, we're going to go ahead and start with the conversation around the Democrats, and that's the party of the donkey. As you know, the Democrats party stance on immigration is largely, they largely support more inclusive immigration policies, a quicker pathway to citizenship, and protections for undocumented immigrants. But let's be real, of course, people. Many believe that this whole pathways to quicker citizenship and more inclusive immigration policies, as I just stated, it just isn't about humanitarianism issues, right? Some say it's a strategic move to expand the Democrats' voting base. With that, and of course, we're going to dive much deeper into some of these particular policy discussions later on throughout the 8-part series. So I want you to bear with us because there is a lot to unpack here. So when we do look at the numbers, the United States Census Bureau projects that by 2045, white Americans will no longer be the majority in this country. And that's for the first time in United States history. Non-Hispanic whites will make up less than 50% of the population. And so, it creates some stark questions that need to be answered. And so, the number one question with regards to that is this shift happening organically? Or is it something that is, being engineered through immigration policies? Many on the right, of course, believe that Democrats wants to fast track undocumented migrants, again, to secure future votes. I know that's been a lot of the conversation out there, especially when you have so many sanctuary cities that already have strapped budgets, right? When we look at the city of Chicago, strapped budgets, there are people in marginalized communities that have been screaming forever for community centers, to turn abandoned buildings into community centers. And the city says, well, we just don't have the money. But then when you look at the amount of money that the city of Chicago is spending, somewhere around over $600 million they have spent thus far. That's money that could really probably went to those community centers, right? An opportunity to build infrastructure in some of these marginalized, disenfranchised communities. And so, I hear the argument, why, right? And so many, again, believe that the argument is really to fast track undocumented migrants in an effort to get those future votes. Now, think about it. I think it's important to note that if new immigrants overwhelmingly vote Democrat, then allowing millions into the country could tilt elections for decades. And that's something to think about. And when I think about that, another interesting topic or a situation that comes to mind that I've heard of that took place around the 1964-65. I think it was around when Lyndon Baines Johnson, better known as LBJ, said, if we pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, we will have them voting Democrat for the next 50 years. And I have to say, LBJ wasn't wrong. He was not lying. But also, he didn't call them black, right? He didn't call them black, but he used a different name at that time. But that's more for us to talk about in the future. But he definitely was right. When they did in fact pass the 1964 Civil Rights Act, many African Americans became Democrats. And it's sort of interesting enough to know that in 1964, I believe 60% of African Americans saw themselves as Democrat, where 40% of those African Americans, on the other hand, saw themselves as conservatives, Republicans. Now, fast forward in 2020, I believe it's 92% African Americans identify as Democrats currently right now. And again, when we look at the election in 2024, Democrats have lost some of those African American voters to the Republican Party. And so again, that begs the question, are we fast tracking immigrants for the opportunity to garner votes that they may have lost in this previous election? Sort of makes you wonder, make you think. So, but when we look in not 1964, but we move forward past that in 2020, 65% of Latino voters supported Joe Biden, while only 32% had backed Trump. Now, I would have to say that's a massive gap. And then there's the whole conversation around DEI, better known as diversity, equity, and inclusion. That particular policy push, where Democrats are championing DEI policies across corporate America, the space of education and government. And they're arguing that a more diverse workforce and leadership structure, in fact, leads to better outcomes. But of course, opponents of DEI, critics of DEI argue that DEI isn't just about equality. In fact, they're saying that it's about fundamentally reshaping America's identity. And we know who's saying that, and that's the Republican, all right? The GOP, the party of the elephant. And so the reality is that immigration is already shifting racial and cultural makeup of the country. Some communities welcome DEI, right? And other communities see it as a direct challenge to their way of life. But interestingly enough, this is where I think things get really tricky, people. This is where things get really tricky, family. While many Democrats advocate for open borders and policies, I want to know who benefits. And I also want to know who loses. That's an important piece that needs to be answered. So as we go ahead and, look at the Republican side, their perspective, which we already talked about, the Democrats' perspective on immigration. But let's look at the Republican side. Let's examine some things on their side. Interestingly enough, the GOP stance on immigration is a little bit more simpler than I think than the Democrats' whole policy stance on immigration. And the GOP is pretty simple. They believe that less of it is best, and stricter enforcement around immigration is what's needed. They also argue that an unchecked border brings crimes, lower wages, and puts undue strain on social services. But behind the whole policy debate, there is this, I think, for the GOP stance, underlying fear of losing cultural and political dominance in this country. For many conservative, immigration represents an existential threat. If white Americans, of course, and we've heard this in numerous studies, that if white Americans do not increase their birth rates by the year of 2045, they will become the minority in a country in which they once dominated. And so that's something really to think about. White Americans are now the minority, and people of color have become the majority. And of course, anytime you have that particular shift, then there is not only a racial shift, but then there becomes a cultural shift. Already in this country, that when you call many businesses and companies and whatever that is, there's a prompt on the phone. Dial 1 for English, dial 2 for Spanish. And the way the fear is, the way that things are going, it'll be soon dial 1 for Spanish and then dial 2 for English. And that's something that really I believe keeps some communities up at night. And again, so in terms of looking at the study that I'm talking about, I believe that the data was the U.S. birth rates is, for white women have declined significantly. Okay. I believe it's somewhere around 1.6 children per woman. And we're talking about Caucasian women in the country. And that was I believe, in 2023. And so when we look at the same study and we're talking about Latino birth rates, they remain a little bit higher. And I think that was somewhere around 1.9 children per woman. And so, again, those numbers really sort of, like I said before, keep some individuals up at night. And so the right-wing response to all of this is, of course, to disengage from policies that promote racial diversity. Many conservatives, as you know, believe that DEI initiatives and affirmative action and immigration laws disproportionately favor minorities at their expense. And we've hearing a lot of conversation come from the Trump administration as of late around the whole DEI, banning DEI. I believe that was one of the first set of executive orders that President Trump had signed, was the banishment, if you will, of DEI programs at the federal level. Again, so when we look at this, we can sort of say, I can see that. Republicans, of course, also argue that illegal immigration hurts black and brown workers. They might have a point with this one. I've heard a lot of conversation come from African American communities that also demonstrate their concern with regards to wages and employment. In fact, some studies that I reviewed showed that low-income Black Americans often compete with undocumented immigrants for the same jobs in industries such as construction and agriculture and hospitality. We know that if employers are able to hire undocumented workers for lower wages, the propensity for those wages to have an increase is not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And so African American communities, won't have an opportunity to see increases in, with some of those, jobs that we just spoke about. Again, so lower wages means fewer job opportunities, and that's a real concern for many communities, especially Black and brown communities, especially African American communities. So while Democrats push for inclusivity, of course, Republicans say, hold on, at what cost? And these are both valid concerns on both sides of the aisles. I think furthermore, when we look at immigration and how it impacts Black and brown communities, we have to sort of say, in terms of talking about the politicians with regards to debate, of course, one of the things that we hardly hear about, and we somewhat heard it in the Trump administration, but they rarely talk about how it affects us. The GOP, the Republican Party's been talking a lot about issues around crime and those particular types of things, and we heard some of the horror stories that go on with that, and they're very true. And the issue that took place in Aurora, the issue that took place with the undocumented migrant that set the woman on fire in New York, the Lake and Riley issue that had took place, the Noangre girl that was in Texas that was raped and murdered and killed. Those are particular things that that the GOP, sort of shared with us in terms of how we were being impacted by immigration and those particular types of things. And of course, Democrats have played it down because at the same time, Democrats are also absolutely correct. The rate in which undocumented workers or illegal or immigrants commit crimes in this country is significantly lower than native-born individuals here in this community. Is very low. But at the same time, we also realize that many of these individuals come here for a better chance at life and things of that particular nature. And they try to use the sort of the policies that are already in place in an effort to do so, but through claiming asylum. But we'll talk a little bit more about that because the asylum process, as we all know, is not necessarily meant to be used for individuals that just are basically trying to find a better economic, try to change their lifestyles. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. But one of the things that I do want to get back into our conversation and not sort of veer off a little bit is talking about issues and how it affects us. And I think a lot of it is around the economic struggle, with regards to immigration. So the reality is that undocumented immigrants and low-wage black workers often, as we know, compete for the same jobs. And again, we talked about the 2020 study that came from the Center for Immigration Studies that found that black employment rates dropped when immigration increased, especially for those without a college degree. And again, as we already said, that's the same story with regards to wages. More low-wage labor in the market, of course, drives down wages. When we look at political influence, immigration, of course, as we know, reshapes the political landscape, sometimes at the expense of the black voter. And we've seen that happen, whereas the Democratic Party was losing a lot of voters, and the Republican Party picked up some African-American votes, quite a bit of African-American votes. And the hope is that, there was talk, I think the Republicans were talking about, they're going to use undocumented migrants to be able to sort of shoulder or some of those particular votes that they lost with African-American and Latino voters. So as we look at Latino and Asian populations, and as they tend to grow, black political power could become diluted, especially in cities where coalition building is critical. The same case goes for criminal justice and immigration policies. Black Americans have historically, of course, as you know, faced harsher penalties for minor offenses, while some undocumented immigrants receive leniency in some of these sanctuary cities. Now, this, of course, raises some concern, of course, about double standards in law enforcement and also in the criminal justice community. So, again, looking at public resources and housings in cities like New York and Chicago. Again, I talked a little bit about this. You have minority African-American communities, again, looking at wanting to create community centers, affordable housing, things of this particular nature. And of course, the conversation is no, we don't have the monies, only to find out that X amount of millions of dollars are going towards migrant communities and things of that particular nature, and things are stretched pretty thin. But then when we look at black residents in these cities who are already struggling, that's adding more competition, and of course that creates a real problem. So, I think it's important for us to be real with ourselves on both sides of the aisle, that immigration isn't a simple issue of compassion versus cruelty. In fact, family, it's a battle over economics, politics, and power. And so I think that's something that we definitely need to understand. So moving the needle forward, how do we reshape the future of immigration policy? How can we play a role in shaping the future of immigration policies. And I think that sort of rests on a few questions here. I think those questions sort of rest around border security versus humanitarianism, right? Border security, that's a big issue with Republicans. Humanitarianism is a big issue, with Democrats. So how can we secure the border while still allowing for opportunities for legal migration? I think that's a big question there. When we explore areas in terms of reshaping immigration policy, we also have to look at the impact. How do we ensure that immigration policies don't disproportionately hurt Black and brown workers? I think that's also equally important. With regards to political power, right? I think it's also important that we begin to ask the question, how do we balance these current demographic shifts while maintaining fair political representation? Now, I think that all of the questions that I just sort of posed here are important questions. And I think that these are questions that really sort of get down to the root causes and ask root cause issues, address root cause issues. And it's not just about the same old borders versus build the wall rhetoric that we've been hearing over the past 3-4 years. I think that if we can get some answers to these questions and engage our political leaders in these particular questions and be a part of the decision-making process, I think that we can sort of fix and address our immigration policies. So, like anything in my podcast, and you guys are probably new to it, this is my first episode. One of the things I really want to be able to do outside of entertain, educate, and enlighten is to also provide a call to action, right? We know the problems, but I think it's also important for us to, number one, identify the solutions, right? And we know that the immigration debate is about more than just who crosses the border. In fact, it's about who holds power, who gets the opportunities, and who sets the direction for this country's future, I think is important. And as Black and brown communities, we must, of course, stay informed. We must stay engaged, and we must remain strategic. Because here's the issue, family. Here's the issue, guys. If we're not at the table, right, then when these policies are made, guess what? We're going to be on the menu. And I'll say that again. That if we're not at the table when these policies are made, then we will be on the menu. And I want you to think about that. So again, family, it was great having you for this particular podcast. I want to remind you that we have an additional 7 other episodes coming up. So stay on the lookout for that. Here in this particular podcast series, we're going to unpack a lot with regards to the whole immigration debate. I really hope that you enjoyed this particular first episode with regards regarding the immigration debate as it relates to varying perspectives from the Republicans to the Democrat side of the House. And again, family, I just want you to remember, politics isn't just about the left or the right. It's about power. And so until next time, I want you to stay informed. I want you to stay engaged, and I want you to stay prayed up. Peace and bless you.
That's all for today's episode of The Oneal Perspective, Politics, Power, and Policy. I hope you learned something new, got inspired, and maybe had a little fun along the way. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and join us next time for more thought-provoking conversations. Until then, stay informed and stay empowered.